It's my great pleasure I'm not going to introduce him because his bio is there, and those of you who know him knows he needs no introduction, and I think when he speaks, you will understand why. So, Mr. Akbar, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming His Excellency M.J. Akbar, Member of Parliament, former Indian Minister of State for External Affairs, onto the stage to deliver the third keynote speech.
Thank you very much, my friend. I'm very happy to introduce what might be called the third dimension to this conflict. I believe it is important not in itself because of India's geostrategic presence, but also because India has given voice to the approach that a large number of countries have historically taken to conflict resolution. The search for conflict resolution, or sometimes as so grandiloquently we describe it, world peace, has been a central objective of India's foreign policy right from the immediate days of post-colonization. In fact, India initiated what might be called the lexicon of diplomacy in the post-colonial age. The term Third World, for instance, was first heard at the Asian Relations Conference inaugurated by Nehru at the picturesque Delhi Fort in 1947, in March 1947. So that's actually a few months before independence, when about 30 plus delegations from the world striving to emerge from colonialism gathered there. The range of representation was quite impressive for 46, 47, included Mongolia, Korea, actually who reached on the last day of the conference because they missed their flight from Shanghai, things which are very familiar to all those who organize conferences, even today. But it was very optimistic. These 4 Tibetans walked for 21 days through the Himalaya to represent Lhasa, and in order to claim their separate credentials from what was then Chiang Kai-shek's China. I can't resist placing before you a quotation from the last imperial voice in Delhi, who was a person called Terence Shone. He was a British High Commissioner. Britain actually technically had a High Commissioner to the British Raj, who commented upon the usage of this strange new term called Third World. Otherwise, he was quite underwhelmed by the pure rhapsody of the speeches that he heard from these bubbling new leaders of the world, which was saved by absurdity only by flashes of humor. But that, of course, may have been the last sigh of the Sahib as he took a final lingering look at the old fort on his way out of history. But from this concept of the Third World emerged as a offspring called non-alignment. As the first 2 worlds fought against each other in what famously became known as the Cold War, the Third World veered towards an idea that found fruition in 1955 at Bandung in a mantra called Panchshila. The 5 points were slightly repetitive, as I'm sure Bilahari will confirm from his long experience. Territorial integrity, non-aggression, non-interference, peaceful coexistence, and apart from equality, the rest mean more or less the same thing. But they became a magnet for Afro-Asian solidarity, and from there emerged in 1961 at a conference in Belgrade, hosted by Tito, with Nehru, of course, and with Gamal Nasser, when the idea of non-alignment was raised to the status of an international movement, where it remains perched, albeit now slightly precariously. As the principal architect, Nehru turned non-alignment into the focal point of Indian foreign policy. But he did not recognize a very fundamental weakness of non-alignment. Nehru had mistaken an idea for an ideology. An idea is not a doctrine, and efforts to dress it up as one only expose its limitations. At its most elastic, non-alignment asserted that if nations signed a piece of paper demanding peace or confirming peace, there would be peace. The inadequacies of a piece of paper, I think, are also a part of the discussion today. These words emerged from a mouth without teeth. There was no strategic analysis of potential conflict or indeed any dispute resolution mechanism in the woolly ambience of non-alignment. History has a caustic sense of humor. Precisely 1 year after Belgrade, India paid a very heavy price for Nehru's illusions. In October 1962, just 1 year after Belgrade, China, a signatory to Panchsheel, crushed India's under-equipped and under-resourced defense forces along the Himalaya and drew a military line upon a disputed border. A humiliated Nehru quickly abandoned a basic tenement of non-alignment and wrote anxiously to America for military aid. Trapped in his own rhetoric, Nehru had neglected India's security requirements. Along with his defense minister Krishna Menon, he consciously downgraded India's defense production and capability. His investment in starry goodwill seems incomprehensible in retrospect. I'll just give you one example, won't labor you with too much. You, I think, might be surprised, if not totally startled, to learn that Nehru twice was offered permanent membership of the Security Council by both superpowers. And twice, I suppose like Caesar's crown, he refused. In 1950, America wanted India to take that seat. And in 1955, the Soviet Union made a similar suggestion through Bulganin. In August 1950, Nehru wrote to his sister, Mrs. Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, who was India's ambassador in Washington at that time, that India would not become a member at the cost of Beijing's claims. Nehru kept the secret from the Indian people, fully conscious of the negative impact this would have on opinion. Today, permanent membership of the UN Security Council is a declared objective of India's foreign policy. And we don't know how long we will have to wait. Equally sobering was India's experience in the autumn of 1965 when Pakistan launched a multi-pronged military invasion to capture Kashmir. Some of India's closest friends in the non-aligned world offered to send military supplies to Pakistan at the height of war. Non-alignment had left India lonely rather than aligned. India understood through experience that solidarity is important without substance. In 1970, India took corrective action. In 1970, NAM resolved at Lusaka to abstain from big power alliances and pacts. 1 year later, India signed the Indo-Soviet Treaty. Half a century after he was born, non-alignment has become a baby with a beard. It has never quite grown up. Today, India takes a very different approach towards conflict resolution. India's commitment to peace has been layered by a realistic appreciation of the shifting counters of this dynamic challenge. Today, our policy has moved from non-alignment to multi-alignment, a series of parallel relationships that strengthen bilateral relationships and seek a common approach towards security, economic equity, and the elimination of existential dangers like terrorism. India believes in friendship without dependence and cooperation in the common cause of stability, dialogue, and equitable prosperity. For us, equitable is actually as important as prosperity, as the fundamentals of the 21st century world order. A globalized world has demands that are different to a polarized world. Stability rests on multipolar support systems rather than the will or bidding of powers and superpowers. The 5 pillars of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's foreign policy are rooted in India's national interest, civilizational philosophy, and the Republican democratic ethos of the 21st century. They are Samman, respect for sovereignty; Samvad, greater engagement with all countries, all; Suraksha, security. Without security, everything else becomes futile. Futile. You cannot outsource security. Samriddhi, shared prosperity; Sanskriti and Sabhyata, the persuasive reach of cultural values anchored in a philosophy which believes that the world is a family. These principles enable India to maintain friendships across binaries. And this is a very, very crucial element of foreign policy as we practice. Observers and analysts are sometimes surprised to learn that Prime Minister Modi can welcome Prime Minister Netanyahu in Delhi as an honored guest in early January, and within 3 weeks become the first Indian PM to visit Palestine and receive its highest civilian awards. The world is surprised, but no Indian is surprised. Indians would be surprised and indeed would consider it remiss if this did not happen. India believes that friendship is not a zero-sum game. Our relationships with Washington are at an apex. But Tehran has been a friend of very long standing. Over the last 5 years, many new economic and strategic bridges have been constructed with UAE and Saudi Arabia, and we are determined that they flourish for the good of our people. India constitutes the largest expatriate population in the Gulf. Our investment in our near west, this is our near west, includes Shah Bahar port in Iran, which is being developed as our trade link to Afghanistan and Central Asia, regions which have been blocked by an obstinate countrywide wall, forcing India to create sea and air corridors. In Afghanistan, we are engaged in development projects in almost every province designed to improve the life of our Afghan friends. Actually, we probably have a presence in far more provinces in Afghanistan than any other country without a single soldier there. I think both America and Iran know that the costs of war are rarely secret, but the price of a US-Iran conflict will be paid in many currencies. Both the United States and Iran have enough experience to know that war does not recognize any boundaries. The potential for chaos should be measured carefully by belligerents. So far, we have witnessed a war of nerves. But diplomacy is surely about preventing a nervous breakdown. The confrontation over Grace 1 and the Astana Impero indicates how quickly an incident can become a casus belli. If the British warship MHS Duncan had reached the flashpoint earlier, forget Donald Trump's orders and non-orders, would we have seen provocative shooting? There are itchy fingers at every level of weaponry. State and non-state actors are active across the turbulence of West Asia, fueled by ideological zeal and sectarian favor. None of this is in our immediate geopolitical and geo-economic interest. The nature of war itself is constantly evolving. We often suppose that there have been only 2 world wars in the last 100 years. I can think of at least 5. Between the First and the Second World War began the life and death struggle for liberation from colonization. That was a World War II. With the non-violent Mahatma Gandhi among a pantheon of heroes, all of them following their own separate strategies. The Cold War was a world war. It continued for at least 4 intense decades. We are currently in the midst of a 5th World War, which is the war against terrorism, a dangerous, barbaric, immoral, and viral epidemic that remains to be defeated. There is another kind of war which is gradually beginning to dominate this charred landscape, the long, warm war. It has many commas, but no full stop. It never becomes a conflagration, but its embers continue to glow. taking a periodic toll. It is a state of continual, if not perpetual, conflict, which drains life rather than kills instantly. Its battlefields are rife with false flags. Long war theorists imagine that since the cost is spread, it is containable. And because it refrains from all-out conflict, it is less than a crisis, dangerous to fall into such illusions. But because of this, the temptation to use terrorists as surrogates actually increases. The one conflict which is not amenable to resolution through dialogue is the war against terrorism. Conventional wisdom dates the present US-Iran conflict to the success of the Islamic Revolution in 79. But as we all know, memories are longer than that. There is one point about 1971 that has been almost regularly forgotten in the discourse. 1979 is a year about which many books are still await to be written. It has not been analyzed or discussed in its full implications. One of the most important consequences of 1979 was the emergence over a decade of very bitter experience. I'm not in the business of doing blame games, I'm just merely trying to analyze. Over a decade of very brutal and bitter experience, the emergence of a Shia strategic space, which is a new phenomenon on the map of the Muslim world. After 1979, Iran, which was still in its very teething early stage, was challenged immediately by Iraq. There was a time when Saddam Hussein was promising to come to Tehran in 2 weeks or 1 week, or heaven knows how quickly his trucks would move. It took 8 years, eventually, because Iran fought back. But today, to cut a rather long, complex story short, there is the emergence of what might be called, these terms are open to discussion and surely open to change with discussion, a strategic space that stretches between the western border of Afghanistan, through Iran, through Iraq, which is now has, because of democracy, obviously a Shia majority government, through Syria and towards Lebanon. Now, it is a space that Iran is not likely to surrender in a hurry. It has been created by Iran over a very long time. Below that, there is a consequent consolidation, which is taking place, if you like, by the Sunni Arab world, which is trying to protect its own interests, led by Saudi Arabia. In this regional conflict, the presence of superpowers is not as dependent upon consistency and ideology as we might imagine. Superpowers intervene in pursuit of their own either immediate, medium-term or long-term interests. And in that space, Iran and the United States have cooperated far more often than they would admit. One example which went public was the Contra deal during the Reagan years. But there have been others. All I'm saying is that pragmatism has always been as important a factor in relationships, including relationships of conflict, as professed ideology. Variables of national interest determines levels of tension between countries. This is actually welcome, because common sense suggests that it is in neither side's interest to slide towards a destructive open war. However, we all know the dangers of brinkmanship any human error can propel. I would like to contrast this with our own experience in India in the management of what I would like to call, or certainly is, India's most difficult foreign policy challenge. Sometimes we think that the real border problem is with Pakistan, but our longest border problem is with China. And the 1962 war with China still has left a traumatic effect on the Indian mind. It cannot be, that scar cannot be removed, eliminated quite so easily. But over the years, if you think that 62 was the only point, in 1967, there was very serious localized fighting at Nathula and Chola passes. And of course, everyone here remembers June 2017 when Doklam happened. It reminded everyone that life on a precipice can be very slippery. But if that confrontation was contained, it was because of the maturity of political leadership on both sides, as well as a commitment made by both nations to non-violence 3 decades ago. It is not a term that we use generally in the context of foreign policy, but this is precisely what India and China did. I think it's 88 or 87, I might have the date wrong. When they signed what is known colloquially as the Agreement of Peace and Tranquility on the border, what was the fundamental principle of that? One, that whatever happens, we shall not exchange, no bullet should be fired across the border. And that has held remarkably. It's a remarkable achievement. But more important for us, what is the doctrine behind this relationship? Differences must not be allowed to become disputes. Disputes must not be allowed to become conflict. How? Through diplomacy. That is the work of diplomacy. Diplomacy is continuous engagement, knowing that one mistake becomes the next crisis. Maybe what is wrong in GCPOA is one word, not joint, not plan, not action, whatever their merits or demerits, but comprehensive. The moment you call anything comprehensive, there is a kind of finality to it, an implicit finality. But we know that peace is constantly discussed, negotiated, measured, and protected. And that is why when Doklam happens over weeks, we still find the resources, national resources, to seek meetings and solutions through peace. The relations between India and Pakistan, in contrast, remain stagnant or even septic for one reason alone, and that is Pakistan's continued and endemic use of violence and particularly terrorism against India. It cannot succeed, and it will not succeed, as long as it thinks that violence is an option or a solution. Don't take my word for it. In July, we are not far away from July, Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan admitted in his usual grammatically correct English that between 30,000 and 40,000 terrorists who target India are still getting sanctuary and assistance on Pakistani soil. This is a public statement. Think of the numbers. This is equivalent to a parallel terrorist army. As our Prime Minister Narendra Modi has said, there is no good terrorism, there is no bad terrorism. And we are not amenable to any dialogue with anyone who still has nuanced views on the subject. The good news is that the US-Iran conflict, good of course is a comparative term, is that it remains in the hands or in the control of states rather than in the grip of non-state activists. The question before the two governments is quite simple. Will they talk before inflicting serious, if not incalculable, harm on the region, or will they talk afterwards? India believes that states must find the route to direct dialogue, or where that seems difficult, elliptical engagement. Skepticism about a total resolution of problems between the United States and Iran should not preclude efforts for a partial one. Friends can help create conditions for direct engagement between principles. War is not a solution. Thank you.
Minister Abba has kindly agreed to take a few questions. We are almost out of time, so please identify yourself, be brief, and direct to the point. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Esfandio Batmangelic. Your Excellency, you traced the really interesting transition from India's position with a foreign policy of non-alignment to multiple alignments. I was curious if you could comment on something important that seems to have happened in that time frame, which is India's acquisition of a nuclear weapon and the security guarantee that that provides. Given that we're talking about the fate of the nuclear deal, I wonder what lessons Iran might draw from the question of proliferation and its impact on flexibility in its foreign policy. Thank you.
We'll take one more question. Shikata first, and later let him answer first. I think. Okay, please.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Japan and India have been implementing Indo-Pacific Initiative. I understand the free and open Indo-Pacific, the free, open. These concepts are critically important for all over the world, including the Persian Gulf and Strait of Hormuz. I understand India distances herself from the so-called coalition of the willing proposed by the United States. But should tension escalate, would India continue to guard her own vessels by herself? Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. I think there is one point in common to both the questions, that where security is concerned, I think India's is very clear from our own experience, from our own understanding, that security is not a negotiable instruments act. Security is something that every nation determines for itself and takes whatever concrete decisions it requires in its own judgment to ensure security. And the India's transition from non-alignment, where, as I said, security was assigned to a piece of paper, which, was torn apart by events, is enough evidence for it to move towards a regime where, when we say peace and security, we should also add that peace doesn't come without security. And this is something that most nations, I think, have understood. On this, we are committed to clause, we are committed to open seas and so on. We have said this very often at any forum, United Nations, trilateral, bilateral, multilateral. It has been a constant theme of our policy, and we hope that this remains a very important emerging doctrine. I may just want a thought occurred to me, which I may want to suggest here, that the real challenge of the 21st century, land has exhausted its capability. The real challenge is now going to be how we manage seas and space. And by space, actually, I include net and all the communication systems that are taking not really outer space, but also the space that we use. It took us a whole survival of human existence to come close to finding sufficiently acceptable laws on land. How long is it going to take us to find sufficiently acceptable laws on sea and on space? We haven't even begun discussing what we need to do. So there is a huge amount of work ahead. But if we want to find a sensible way forward, I think we are already running out of time.
Well, we are running out of time, but Anthony has asked a question. Anthony.
I like your thing about ideology versus slogan. And I remember Hindi Chindi Bye Bye, and then there was war. But I was very curious, how does one rationalize Sam Manikshaw's action? in Bangladesh, its creation?
Very sorry, Anthony. It was not Sam Manikshaw's decision. In India, generals don't take decisions. Decisions are taken by elected prime ministers. Generals implement decisions. You may be confusing us subliminally with another country in the neighborhood. But we took a decision after 10 months of nearly 10 million refugees. After having a crackdown which is widely recognized as the most despotic, brutal mass murder of people. After a liberation movement that had begun in March, when the world was continuing to remain indifferent, and a country was literally flooding into us. And just want to end this by saying, I cannot think of another instance where an army which has succeeded on a particular battlefield has walked away from the battlefield within 90 days without any claims political.
Well, we have indeed run out of time, in fact, gone a bit over. So please join me in thanking Minister.